Greetings, everyone. So I need my cup of Joe to function. I made a bracha already. All right, we continue our discussion about the elements of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the original elements of which it was all weaved from, and subsequently was collated as the Mishnah and the Talmud. But its original, so as we explained in last session, its original form was built around Chumash. So things like the Mechilta, Safra, Sifrei, those that type of literature is the best reflection of how it was originally taught. It was taught as a pirush built around Chumash. Right. Although, as we're going to explain, it always lent itself to being reformulated as the Mishnah and Talmud. It always lent itself to that. It was designed to fall into those manifestations also. But let's go step by step. As we said at the end of last session, Moshe had learned things called the information that he was informed is the written law, and information that he was informed is the oral law. And when he came down and taught it, that which he identifies as written law is the pasuk. People wrote down in scrolls, and it subsequently became, the Torah Shebechsav as we know it on the last day of his life, when he was officially sanctioned with 13 Sifrei Torah that he wrote on the day of his death. And then all those scrolls became, for lack of a better word, obsolete unless they were completed. So in preparation for the emergence of the Sefer Torah as we know it, which happened at the end of the 40 years, in preparation, they still were dividing up what is destined to be called the pasuk, which was written down, and the oral interpretation. Okay, so as we said, we are recapping and then going into greater depth, right? A great deal of interpretation came from God himself, right? For instance, Prietz Hadar, that means the esrog. God himself taught that, right? Now the fact that we in the Perek Lulav Agazel bring all types of drashos to prove what the Prietz Hadar is and what the Hadas is and what the Arava is, right? It is not to say that until those Amoraim or Tanoim that are over there in Perek Lulav Agazel, which was like 1,000 years after the giving of Torah, we weren't sure, and they legislated. That's not the pshat. But as the Ram said, they always knew, because they had to take Lulav already. Even if they, let's say, didn't have to do it in the desert yet, let us say, that the mitzvahs, many mitzvahs only went into effect when they entered the land of Israel, but still, within 40 years, they had to put all this stuff into practice, right? If not sooner. So of course, we weren't waiting for these drashos that were said 1,000 years later to come to the conclusion as to what is a esrog, what is a lulav, what is a hadas, what is an arava. But rather, it is one of the exercises of Torah to learn Chumash analytically and use the midas shatar nidreshes bahem, right, to try to find allusions in the text that support the God-given definitions and interpretations. So the Tanoim and Amoraim, in Perek Lulav Agazel, or in many places in Shas, are not, with their drashos, they're not creating the interpretation. Rather, they are, linking, what was handed down orally with the text and trying to find the connection between the two. Connect the God-given definitions and interpretations to the text. And that's one function of the drashos, right? Now, what happens if you can't find any allusion in the text or any reasonable allusion? So that's what we call Halacha l'Moshe Misinai. which is in effect an oral pasuk. It's not an interpretation on the pasuk, it's like an oral pasuk, right? Because it cannot be linked to anything in the Chumash by any reasonable means. So that's what's called Halacha Moshe Sinai, right? And that's just between the regular Torah Shabbat, that it's all from God. But what we call Halacha Moshe Sinai is this cannot be connected to the text. This is carried; it stands on its own orally, right? And these are the two types of God-given oral law, right? But there's another thing. Right, and there's that God endorsed this process of the Drashos, the same process that we use to try to link, the God-given interpretation to the text. That same process could be used to create new halacha, right? If there's a new shah that came up and we want to derive, from the from the Torah that we have already, pull out principles, pull out a new psak, for this new question that has arisen, or even if it wasn't by necessity, right? That's also the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Just like the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is to find allusions to the oral tradition in the text of the Bible. There's also a mitzvah just to get to work and create new Torah, not new Torah. I should be careful with what I say. Chidushay Torah. New laws based on the old laws, like expand the Torah. Don't change the Torah, expand it. There are tools of how the Torah is to be interpreted and expanded. Get to work. That's Talmud Torah. So even if a new shaila didn't arise, it wasn't, no great necessity, right? There should be academic activism. Yes, I know we grapple with this in modern society. Should Congress be legislatively active, right? Should there be judicial activism? As we will explain in Torah, the Torah should be expanded, and people should sit and contemplate what if, even if the question hasn't come up. What if, because it may come up. And the few times in the time where Revirmia asked a question that was considered crazy, it actually happened. Taught us a lesson. It could happen. Even things that can happen. We're told drush v'kabel schar, like Irani Dachas or Ben Sora Moreb, which it's a machlokas, but according to Manjar says it'll never happen in physical reality because the criteria, to make the grade to be that type of city or that type of kid, that the kid who's barely bar mitzvah, just over the age of bar mitzvah, right? 13 is between 30 and 30. It's so rare, it's almost impossible. Drush v'kabel schar. I know, darshan, not just philosophically from moral men, but even what would the halacha be if? What would the halacha be if? Right? Academic activism, call it. Academic activism, right? Right? So we'll call it academic activism, not called judicial activism, and that we will discuss maybe by the end of this session also. All right, so there's not just going deeper into what we have and linking the text with the oral tradition. There's also getting to work with those very same tools to make new law, and that is a good thing. The Torah wants that, right? And the Rambam says that Moshe himself also engaged in that, even though he's learning directly from God, he also engaged in that, academic activism, went to the base medrash and they used to mix it up, and ask what do you do if, and even if a question didn't arise, not just reactively to questions that arose, they generated, their own questions and their own possibilities and, made Chidushay Torah, right? So now, is there a difference between when we're using the Drashos to understand, understand what the Torah meant, i.e., right? I mean to say, when we are just connecting the oral tradition to the text, and we're just, we already know what we're looking for, right? As it were, we know the results. We're just, reverse engineering an experiment of how to get to that result. Is there a difference between that and when we use the Drashos and the other tools of Talmud Torah to create new law, which is a biblically mandated, right? God wants us to do that. He wants us to do that. He wants us to interpret the law. He wants us to expand the law, not just reactively if a shaila comes up, but even if a shaila has not come up. Drush v'kabel schar. Yeah. All right. Is there a difference between these two forms of learning, right? Of when we know what God wants already, we're just trying to see how it's alluded to in the text, versus coming up with chidushim. Is there a difference? Yes. Some very major differences, right? First and foremost, says the Rambam, and like we said, and we'll keep our bid that we are Rambam centric in this series and in all our series, because the Rambam gave us the most easily understandable systematic approach. Okay, right. Going to the Rambam, all machlokes, which there seems to be no shortage of, right, in the Mishnah and the Talmud, all machlokes is purely in new law, not in God-given law. Not in God-given law. And as the Rambam sums it up in Hilchos Mamrim, he says it here in the Pirush HaMishnah that we're quoting from also, but he just sums it up so succinctly in Hilchos Mamrim. Kol davar sheyesh bo machlokes biyadua she'eno mimoshe. If you see a machlokes, mutter asur, chayev potter, you know Moshe said nothing on the issue. In the name of God, what he means to say. Moshe, in the name of God, did not say anything on the issue. Not because we fanatically, with great zealousness, preserve whatever we were taught from Moshe in the name of God. We would make sure to never forget that. And more than that, let's say, and the Ram writes this by us in the Pirush HaMishnayos, but we'll have to qualify it a little bit more in light of what he writes in Hilchos Mamrim. But the Rambam writes by us in the Pirush HaMishnayos that we're currently basing our discussion on in his Hakdama Tizroi. Right? Says, let's say we two guys have a machlokas, and one guy says, I say what I say because this is how I use the Gzera Shava. The guy says, well, buddy, what I'm telling you is not the product of that I did the drasha differently. I heard from my Rebbe, you heard from his Rebbe, you heard from his Rebbe, that God himself explained it this way. Right? In a case of a machlokas like that, the Rambam says, right, the guy who obviously was absent that day in yeshiva, or his Rebbe didn't give him a complete education, should immediately submit. Right? Immediately say, if there's a tradition dating back to Moshe in the name of God, that Moshe in the name of God explained this way, who am I to argue? Of course not. Right? So the one without the Masorah, without the tradition, should submit to the one who does have the tradition. Right? And that's, we do find in a few places in the Shas, this statement, this saying, Im Kabbalah hi nekabel, vim ledin yesh tshuva. Look, hey, if you're saying it's a Kabbalah, this is like something that was received, transmitted through generations, okay, nekabel. Im Kabbalah hi nekabel, vim ledin. But if you're making a drasha, I can answer you, right? Which would back up this idea of the Rambam, that if there's a Masorah, the one without the Masorah should immediately submit to the one with the Masorah. So as forgetfulness would not be a reason for machlokas, because the one who has the Masorah should win the debate, because it's not open to debate. It's not open to debate. Right? The one who has the Masorah wins. The one who doesn't have the Masorah should submit. So you are ignorant that there's actually a teaching from Moshe in the name of God himself. Right? So the one without the Masorah should submit to the one with the Masorah. And we find a few cases like that in the Gemara. And by the way, not just as far as Halacha Moshe B'Sinai, but even as far as other issues where seemingly they do have the right to argue, as we're about to explain, but someone attests to the fact that, the prophets had a based in Amadul Yoshav Chagi Anavi on this, walls, Chagi Anavi and he darshan, because we are loath also to argue with settled law, even though we have the right to, we are loath to do so. Right? If it was already settled, well, you don't reopen the case needlessly unless you really feel that there was an error made, right? So, we do find a few cases in Shas. A person alluded, attested to what the old ruling was, or attested to what is the halacha l'Moshe Misinai, and that's it. And so the other party submits, right? And that makes perfect sense, right? You don't argue with God Himself, right? Of course, you could have a guy who's a deviant. He really, I don't mean I meant this in the most literal sense, in the sense that, the guy has a faulty memory. He heard wrong from his Rebbe. Right, he heard wrong, and he honestly believes that he had heard that this is a tradition, and he's wrong. He's just wrong. Right? That's not impossible. That's not impossible, right? But let's talk in concrete terms. I don't know if a person is of, let's say, skeptical of his sanity, right? Or of his, his, what do you want to call it? His intellectual capacity. All right. So of course you got to use common sense, but but let's talk in very concrete terms, right? That we do have talking in the original manifestation of Torah, right? There was one authoritative body, because maybe a lot of people heard it differently. And someone honestly believes this is what Moshe said. This is what he said. So of course, the Jewish people, will be very careful to be very vigilant, right? Not to forget anything Moshe taught in the name of God. Less so what Moshe may have made up. Not made up. I mean, his own chidushei Torah, because as we're about to explain, those could be argued with. We already explained that you could argue with them. Yeah. In real time, but even after it's been paskined, it could be overturned, because after all, it was a chiddush. It was a chiddush, so a later door could learn up differently, as we will explain in a second. Right? But I want to finalize this point that there's the body of the Beis Din Agara, the Grand Rabbinical Court, that sat on the Temple Mount, geographically near where the Mizbeach was, even though, where they sat was not holy, but it was there on the Temple Mount, right, near the Mizbeach, right? So, even though it wasn't the Beis HaMikdash per se, right? It was the designated place of the Beis Hagara, which was, adjacent to the Beis HaMikdash. They were the living embodiment of the Torah Shebaal Peh. So it was all carried in people. But is there a place where this is the authoritative body? Because maybe the way you remember it, your memory is crooked. Maybe your memory is failing you. Maybe you misunderstood. There was a body, a legislative body, that they are the guardians of the Torah Shebaal Peh. In the words of the Rambam, also they are the essence of Torah Shebaal Peh. In every generation, if there's the place of where there's a authoritative understanding, it's in the Beis Din Hagara. So the Rambam, he postulates like the Manda Omar, that a Zaken Mamre, right? That is the guy, the member of Sanhedrin that goes rogue, right? He has his opinion, right? And he's not submitting, He has his opinion, and he's not submitting. He was overruled. They heard him out. They answered him, right? But he still doesn't. He still thinks he's right, right? And he's teaching people not just his opinion, but also telling them to do as he says. Now, if you just teach them his opinion, that's okay. You know, Judaism doesn't censor thought, right? But it's like you give a order. Don't listen to Bezgal. Do what I say. All right, that's different, right? Yeah, that's like that's treason. You're going against the law. You could say academically, I think they're wrong, and this is what I think, right? Academically, but the law is with them. All right, that's okay. That is okay. Right, the Zakim Mamre in Parsha Shofet gets put to death. Right, it's considered to be one of the worst crimes. Right, he gets put to death. Right, the Zakim Mamre gets put to death. Right, is that he is not submitting legally, and he's saying, you know, this is what I think, and do like me, do what I tell you to do. Right, so he is executed. Right, because he's not submitting to the authority of the Beis Nagol. It's like treason. Okay, so now, the Rambam paskins that this is even true, right? It's Machokas in the Gemara. Rambam paskins is even true if the Zakim Mamre says, but I have a Masorah. I heard something from my Rebbe, the name of his Rebbe, or back to Moshe, the name of God, right? And everyone else in the Beis Nagol said, I never heard that. I never heard that. You hear that? I didn't hear that. You know, they hear him out and say, no, sorry, none of us ever heard of that. Right. So if the Beis Din HaGadol does not recognize that there is such a Masorah, then as far as we're concerned, that Masorah doesn't exist. So let's just talk in concrete terms. There could be some gray areas, but we're not here to resolve all the gray areas. But what the Rambam is saying by us in the Pirush HaMishnayos, that anytime a person claims, well, this is a Masorah all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, the name of God, right? And the other guy says, well, I never heard that, but and therefore I'm just going with my drasha. The one who doesn't have the Masorah must submit to the one with the Masorah. He must submit, right? But that's not true when the Beis Din HaGadol, they all ask, you heard that? No, I didn't hear that. You heard that? I didn't hear that. You heard that? Because the Beis Din HaGadol is the absolute embodiment of Torah Sheba'al Peh for its generation, right? And if no one there heard that Masorah, this one guy has it, and the whole Beis Din HaGadol, no one heard of it, and they voted. They have reason to believe it. We think he heard wrong. We think he misunderstood. That's it. So he is overruled, and he has to submit, even though he really believes he has a tradition going back to Moshe in the name of God. Right? Because the ultimate yardstick for truth is the Beis Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim. Right? But absent of that body, right? It's just two individuals: the one without the Masorah, or to submit to the one with the Masorah. Like we said, you got to use common sense. Right, in this, when the Rambam said submit to the guy who claims the Masorah, I mean just because he claims it, right? You have to, you cross-examine him. I mean, this is just, even the Rambam didn't specify this. This is just clear from just basic common sense. What exactly did you hear from your Rebbe, and who did your Rebbe hear it from? How do you know it's all the way back? Of course, you cross-examine him as to why he, why he's so certain that this is a tradition going back to Moshe in the name of God, has to pass the smell test, It has to be that, it's entirely, his story is solid, right? But in principle, of course, the one without the Masorah should submit to the one with the Masorah. Why are you doing guesswork if God himself interpreted a certain way? Okay. So what's an obvious outgrowth of this? If he has to submit, that means that because if God himself interpreted that way, it's immutable, it's incontrovertible, right? Not just you can't argue with God, but you also can't decide, well, maybe God only meant it for that generation. And now we're going to learn up the Torah differently. If God himself interpreted the Torah that way, explained it that way, that is the halacha forever and ever and ever and ever. and the Beis Din HaGadol will just be the guardians of that tradition. They're not going to pass judgment on it, argue with it. They're just going to preserve that tradition. Okay? However, if it's a chiddush that was derived, right? It's not saying that Moshe taught the name of God. It was derived. It was and it doesn't really make a difference in what generation it was derived. The Ram makes very clear. Even if Moshe himself, the generation of Yoshua ben Nun, right, or Moshe did not act as the capacity of Moshe of speaking in the name of God, but Moshe also went to the base Moshe and had his own chidushim, his own personal, like the other Shivim Skanim, right? So, that is only the halacha because it gets ratified by the Beis Din HaGadol. They have to vote on it for it to become, as it's called, settled halacha. Right? Some guy, makes a drasha in the Galil, so now all of a sudden I'm obligated, even if I can't argue with it, because I don't know how to argue with it. Right? These drashas have to be. We're talking about before the Talmud. Things changed, right? But in manner that we'll explain, right? But in the original manifestation of Torah, these drashas, yes, God endorsed the process, but there's a final step of it being ratified into being called settled halacha that's binding on all Jews, right? So that's ratified by the Beis Din. Like they consider this drasha made, they vote on it, makes sense, then it becomes settled halacha for that generation. Right? So first of all, it has to be ratified for it to be settled halacha. Well, we could talk, and discuss whether it's binding on the guy who came up with the chiddush or binding on his city if he's the rabbi of the city, but just for him and just for a city, or it's absolutely nothing until the Beis Din HaGadol ratifies it. It's an area to discuss, right? Right, but let's just talk in the concrete terms that we do know. It's only called settled halacha that's binding on all the Jewish people if it's ratified by the Beis Din HaGadol. Right? But by the same token, it could be disputed in a later generation. Right? It became settled halacha because the Beis Din HaGadol agreed to it. Right? In a later generation, they could re-examine it and say, well, look, this is this chiddush that was arrived at by, disagree with it. We would use, but it was a Gzera Shava that he darshed. We would use that Gzera Shava differently. It's reversible, right? And the new Beis Din HaGadol of a later generation can overturn it and change that settled halacha, as it were. Right? And that's a very major difference. Which also, it seems from the Ram, he doesn't write this black on white. We were a lot more zealous to remember what God said to Moshe, right? Because that's immutable, incontrovertible, it's eternal, right? It's eternal truth. We might have been less zealous remembering the Drashos, because even though we're loath to reopen a can of worms, and to, on purpose, just do judicial activism or legislative activism to overturn. We have no agenda in that. We're happy with settled halacha. Even if it was a chiddush that a particular Beis Din HaGadol arrived at. But probably because it was a halacha that was legislated as opposed to legislated with God's approval of the process. That's why it's even biblically binding, right? As we explained in the last class. In the last class, we said that, that it's very clear from the Rambam. Anyone who says otherwise is not learning the Rambam correctly. Right? The Rambam calls these chidushim divrei sofrim. He's just putting it on an issue of historical record. That you should know that this was a derivation of the rabbis. Right, they use the midas shatar nidrash to expand the Torah as God wants, and God endorsed this process, this way of learning, And on condition it's ratified by the Beis Din, God endorsed this process. This is the way to interpret the Torah. This is the way to do it. God endorsed this process. All right, so therefore it's called biblically binding because God endorsed the process. But it's a process that God endorsed, right? And every generation could engage in that process, and that's why a later generation could relearn things and overturn them. Just they're loath to do so unless they really feel an error was made, or they really understand differently, or whatever the reason. But otherwise, generally speaking, they were loath to do so. Right? And the Rambam himself writes this in the Pirush HaMishnayos, that later generations used the rulings of their predecessors as a basis, and they built on that. Why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? But it is possible, right? It is possible. And that's why, it's very important to have a historical record of knowing very well which drasha created the halacha, as opposed to which drashas just found an allusion to a God-given halacha in the text. And the Rambam endeavors to tag everything, and he calls certain things doraisa per se, certain things divrei sofrim, not to say that it's only rabbinically binding. No, it's biblically binding. Just the rabbis created that halacha, by interpreting the Torah with the God-mandated, God-endorsed process of how Torah is to be interpreted, which also includes the final step of being ratified by the Beis Din Agadol. Right, so it's reversible, technically. And since it's reversible, it is safe to say that they were a little bit less, for lack of a better word. Listen, Torah is very big. That's Torah is huge. And we have the famous saying, tafasta meruba lo tafasta. You try to grab onto the most, you'll lose it all, So, if you have to focus their attention on prioritizing what to remember, of course, they prioritize remembering what God himself said. Moshe said in the name of God, right? They prioritize that. They probably did not prioritize as much. They did their best, I'm sure, right? They didn't prioritize as much remembering the rulings that every generation came up with on their own, right? Which could explain why so that you have a machlokas, Rava and Abaye, right? But this type of question should have come up in the course of human events centuries earlier, because it's such a common thing to happen, right? You ever wonder, you read a lot of Gemaras, you have the Amoraim, which are now living, 1,500 years after Matan Torah, roughly, right? And these are like questions that come up in everyday life, so there's two possibilities, right? Either they're re-examining, they don't care how it was ruled on earlier, which they have the right to do theoretically, depending on how it was originally ratified, and we'll discuss that later in this series. Or simply put, it's entirely possible. Of course, there must have been an earlier ruling. They forgot it, but it was a ruling because it was a ruling, and this goes back to the Rambam's golden rule: Kol davar sheish bo machlokas b'yado. If they're arguing about it, it's not from Moshe. They're not arguing about what Moshe said. That we were very zealous about remembering. All right, so it could be. So this is the type of thing they're arguing about. This, 1,500 years after Torah was given. This is a common question that comes up in the course of regular living, and they're only arguing about it, 1,500 years later. No, earlier generations probably paskined this question already, but that those rulings were not preserved. Okay, so we get back to the drawing board. They were very zealous about preserving what God himself taught, right, through Moshe. And that's mukhrach. We have to say that. All right, so it is, and it's, and you understand why? Because we're free to reconstruct as we see fit, right? If the earlier ruling gets right, we're free to reconstruct. Every generation has the right to relearn, anything that was legislated by an earlier generation. And the amazing is that in every generation, if there was a Beis Din Agadol there to ratify the learning, to make it settled halacha, it's called DeRabbanans. It's called that. You're biblically bound to keep this, biblically bound to understand the Torah this way in this generation. But it's called Divrei Sodom because they're the ones who made the interpretation with the tools given by God, by the God-mandated, God-endorsed process. And that's why it's D'Oraisa, because God endorsed the process. Right? He said, this is the way I want you to go about it. Therefore, it's D'Oraisa, because God himself, this is the way we go about it. And then every generation can, relearn things. Now, so this might sound harsh, so that means Torah is changing. So maybe, God forbid, you could make a reformation in Judaism. God forbid. As my Rosh Yeshiva, Yaakov Arm, used to explain it, and he used it to explain what we say, El Vel Dirugim Chaim. So that we say, Beishan Beisol said polar opposite things. Chayev, Potter, El Vel Dirugim Chaim. He said total opposite things. No. My Rosh Yeshiva said you have to, look at Torah like algebra. X squared is equal to 4. What's X? 2. Only 2. Also negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2 also equals positive 4. And that's how you could have the, Beis Shammai says Osir and Beis Hillel says Mutter. And it's El Vel Dirugim Chaim. It's like 2 and negative 2. They both solve the equation, right? If everyone sticks to the process of how Torah is supposed to be interpreted, with the Midas Torah addressed bam, with the process of how the Chiddush has to be ratified, and you're not violating any psukim, you're not violating anything that was, interpretations that were handed down from Moshe Rabbeinu in the name of God, right? You're allowed to. It's like, so the Torah is not changing. You're just shifting from negative 2 to positive 2, back to negative 2. Or it could be like more, we oversimplify it. It could be more complicated. Torah is a much more complicated equation where it could be like you could solve the equation with multiple variables, not just the 2 variables. Right? And that's what it is. Rabbinic, the interpretation of every generation that every generation is allowed to really learn the difference, sticking to the same tools, and they're working with the same givens, the same psukim, which are immutable, incontrovertible, eternal, right? Same masorot, Baal Peh, from Moshe Rabbeinu in the name of God. Everyone's working with the same axioms, the same givens, and they're using the same methodology. So it's just called that the Torah hasn't changed. It's a formula, and every generation comes up with another variable that fits the formula, right? The formula is not being violated. There's no reformation. It's not x cubed equal to 4. It still remains x squared equal to 4. X squared equal to 4 is not violated, right? They're just coming up with multiple variables that also fit the formula. But the givens of the formula, which are the psukim, which are all the masoret of how God himself interpreted it, and the method, right, and also the not just the academic method, but also the method of how it gets ratified. If all these things are in place, then the Torah hasn't changed. The formula is not violated. Reform Judaism is to go from x squared equal to 4 to x cubed is equal to 4. That's reformation. That's called to change the Torah. All right, we've already hit our limit for today. We'll pick this up again later this week. All right, but we're making progress. All right, and this year should be Li Nishmas, the pure neshama of Avi Mori David Ben Achavar Yosef Dov.